She wasn't trembling from the cold. That's what made him pause. Any other child left barefoot in a Chicago February, wearing nothing but a soaked pink gown that clung to her small frame, would have been hysterical, a mess of tears and desperate pleas on the sidewalk of the city's most exclusive district. But this little girl just stood there, a gray, hand-stitched doll clutched to her chest like a shield, her dark eyes fixed on him with a terrifying kind of clarity. She looked like she already knew the world was empty, yet she had chosen this specific man to ask one last time. "Mister, can you take me in? Nobody wants me." Her voice was small, but it carried a weight that cut through the thunder, a request made by someone who had already calculated the cost of being rejected. Shu Yong had stepped out of those obsidian doors having just signed a death warrant for a rival faction. He had millions in assets moving across the Pacific and a dozen lethal men waiting for his next command to ignite a war. He looked at the girl. Then he looked at his lead guard, whose hand was already reaching out to shove the nuisance away. The guard's hand froze mid-air, then dropped slowly to his side. The look in Shu Yong's eyes had stripped away the need for any verbal command. Shu Yong crouched, his expensive charcoal suit soaking up the gutter water, until he was exactly at eye level with her. Behind him, 4 of the most ruthless men in the Midwest stood like statues in the freezing rain. They had seen Shu Yong kill, and they had seen him build an empire, but they had never seen him kneel. Not for a politician, and certainly not for a soul. "Who told you to find me?" he asked. She didn't look at his suit or his power. She studied the thing living behind his eyes, the same way children who have known true hunger study the dark. Mama said, if she didn't come back, I had to find the man with the serpent on his neck. She said he was the only one in this city who owed a debt to a ghost. As Shu Yong shifted, the collar of his damp white shirt pulled back. There, curled upward toward his ear, was the dark, intricate ink of the serpent dragon. Perla's eyes widened, her cautious trust finally finding a place to land. She didn't pull back. She reached out one small, frozen finger and traced the edge of the tattoo. 6 years had passed since a woman named Carolina had pressed her hands against Shu Yong's bleeding side in a dark alley, told him the world still needed him, and stayed behind to ensure he could run. 72 months of carrying a debt with no recipient, until a girl in a pink dress delivered the bill herself. Shu Yong stood. In one fluid motion, he stripped off his heavy overcoat and wrapped it around her. No hesitation, no ceremony. The hem of the coat hit the wet pavement, swallowing her small form. He looked at his head of security over the top of her head. "Call the penthouse. Tell them we have a guest who needs a warm meal and shoes that fit." He extended his hand, palm up. Perla looked at his hand for 3 long seconds, the time it takes for a life to change. Then, she placed her small, cold fingers into his, tucked her gray doll tighter under her arm, and let him lead her through the golden doors. His coat dragged behind her on the marble floor like the train of a royal gown. Nobody spoke. Every man on that sidewalk understood that the 60 seconds that had just passed had shifted the axis of the city. The serpent had found something worth more than the war. Stay tuned for what the Mafia boss is about to discover will keep you on your toes. Do not forget to like, share, and subscribe to the Cinem Corner channel. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. The elevator doors were a wall of seamless, polished brass that reflected a distorted version of the world they had just left behind. As they stepped inside, the transition was absolute. The roar of the Chicago rain was silenced by the thick, pressurized seal of the doors, replaced by a low, melodic hum of machinery. Perla didn't let go of Shu Yong's hand, but her gaze was pulled upward. She had never been in a golden box before, let alone one that moved toward the stars. She stood in the center of the car, the oversized charcoal overcoat pooling around her feet like a heavy shadow. She reached out with her free hand, pressing a palm flat against the mirrored surface. She watched her own reflection. A small girl in a man's armor, barefoot and bedraggled, climbing into the sky. She didn't look afraid. She looked as though she were waiting for the trick to be revealed, for the gold to turn back into the gray of the streets. Shu Yong watched her through the reflection. He was a man accustomed to the weight of a firearm or the cold pressure of a billion-dollar merger, but the small, damp heat of her hand in his felt more dangerous than both. He could feel the fine tremors of her body as the elevator ascended. Every floor they passed was a mile further away from the life he had understood 10 minutes ago. The doors slid open directly into the penthouse. The space was a vast expanse of glass and shadow, illuminated only by the amber glow of the city grid below. It was a cathedral of minimalist glass and warm marble, a world designed for a man who wanted to see everything coming but wanted nothing to touch him. Perla stopped at the threshold. Her eyes traveled from the floor-to-ceiling windows to the sleek, sharp edges of the furniture. It was beautiful, but it was a cage made of expensive light. She pulled her hand back from Shu Yong's and immediately tucked her gray doll under her arm, gripping it so tightly the knitted limbs went flat. "Is it yours?" she whispered, her voice echoing in the hollow silence of the foyer. "It is," Shu Yong replied, his voice sounding raspy even to his own ears. He watched her take a tentative step onto the marble, her bare, wet footprints leaving a trail of reality on his perfection. "You're safe here, Perla." She didn't answer. Instead, she walked toward the glass, her breath fogging a small, circular patch against the window. Beyond the pane, Chicago was a carpet of burning embers, beautiful and indifferent. She looked down at the gray doll, then back at Shu Yong. She was checking the perimeter, not for luxury, but for exits. Shu Yong stood by the elevator, his jacket off, his shirt damp against his skin. He realized then that the silence of his home, a silence he had spent a decade cultivating, was gone. He could hear her breathing. He could hear the drip of water from her dress onto the floor. For years, he had been the apex predator of this city, a man who answered to no one. But as he looked at the small girl silhouetted against the sky, he felt the invisible tether of the serpent on his neck tighten. The debt had arrived, and it didn't want his money or his blood. It wanted the one thing he had never given anyone, his life. He wasn't just a boss anymore. He was a guardian. And as she turned to look at him, waiting for his next command, Shu Yong realized with a jolt of quiet terror that his life was no longer his own. Perla became a ghost within the glass walls of the penthouse. She did not play, and she rarely spoke. Instead, she moved with a silent, rhythmic caution, drifting into the shadows of the hallways whenever the heavy doors hummed open. From the recessed corners of the dining hall or the darkened curve of the library, she watched the men who came to see him. They were men of war, broad-shouldered and sharp-eyed, their bodies carrying the suppressed energy of coiled springs. They arrived in groups of 3 or 4, smelling of cold rain and expensive tobacco, their voices low and jagged like broken slate. Perla observed them with the systematic patience of a creature that had learned, long ago, that safety was a variable governed by the moods of powerful men. She watched the way they entered the room. No matter how large they were, or how deep their voices boomed in the corridor, they underwent a visible change the moment they crossed the threshold into Shu Yong's presence. Their spines would straighten, their chins would dip, and their eyes would find the floor. In the beginning, the sound of their boots, heavy, rhythmic, and purposeful, made Perla's heart skip a beat, sending her retreating deeper into the velvet curtains, her fingers digging into the soft, gray wool of her doll. But as the days bled into a week, the pattern revealed itself. The violence of the world stayed outside the glass. Inside, there was only the law of the serpent. She sat on the floor behind a minimalist marble pedestal, peering out as a lieutenant delivered a report. The man was scarred and fierce, his hands trembling slightly as he held a digital tablet. Shu Yong didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He sat behind his desk, the sleeves of his white shirt rolled back to reveal the dark, curling tail of the tattoo on his neck. He moved with a terrifying economy of motion, a single nod or a quiet word enough to send the giants scurrying back to the elevator. Perla realized then that the men weren't a threat to her. They were afraid of the man who had taken her in. Shu Yong was the sun around which these dark stars orbited, and she was currently standing within his heat. One evening, a guard named Jinho rounded a corner too quickly, his heavy boots thudding against the hardwood just inches from where Perla sat. In the past, she would have curled into a ball, bracing for the impact of a world that didn't see her. This time, she simply blinked. She looked up at the man's holster, then at his face, and finally at the door where Shu Yong stood. Shu Yong's gaze caught hers from across the room. He didn't smile. He wasn't a man who offered comfort in traditional currency, but he remained standing there, a silent, immovable anchor, until Jinho had bowed and retreated. The heavy footsteps faded into the distance, and for the first time, Perla didn't follow the sound with her ears. She stood up, brushed the dust from her pink gown, and walked toward the center of the room. The fear hadn't vanished, but it had shifted. It was no longer a wild thing that hunted her. It was something Xu Yong kept on a leash. She realized that in this high, silent cage, the sound of boots didn't mean the end of the world. It just meant the world was checking in with its master. Under the dragon's shadow, the ghost was beginning to take shape. The gray doll was more than a toy. It was a map of Perla's survival. It had been squeezed through the slats of fire escapes, dragged across salt-stained pavements, and soaked by the indifferent rains of 3 different neighborhoods. By the 10th day in the penthouse, the wear finally became a wound. The seam along the doll's neck, already strained from years of being held too tight, gave way, spilling a small tuft of aged cotton onto the white marble floor. Perla stared at the doll in her lap, her face going unnervingly still. In the world she came from, a broken thing was a finished thing. Clothes that tore were discarded. People who broke were left behind. She didn't cry, but she began to retreat, her small shoulders hunching as she tried to shove the stuffing back into the gaping hole with trembling fingers. She looked toward the trash bin in the kitchen, her eyes filling with a quiet, practiced grief. Xu Yong saw the movement from the hallway. He didn't approach her directly. He knew better than to startle a creature in mourning, but he stopped Jinho as the guard was heading toward the security room. A few low words were exchanged, a command issued in the sharp, staccato rhythm of the syndicate. 10 minutes later, Jinho returned, not with a weapon or a radio, but with a small, wooden kit. He sat on a low ottoman near the window where Perla was hiding, his massive, scarred frame looking absurd against the delicate furniture. He didn't ask for the doll. He simply opened the box, revealing spools of silk thread and needles that glinted like tiny daggers in the afternoon sun. Perla watched from the shadows of a high-backed chair. She expected him to laugh, or perhaps to simply take the doll and throw it away to spare Xu Yong the sight of its raggedness. Instead, Jinho held out a hand, palm up. "It needs a stitch," the man of war said, his voice surprisingly soft, a low rumble that didn't demand. Slowly, Perla crawled forward and placed the gray doll in his hand. Xu Yong watched from the threshold of his office, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He watched as Jinho, a man who had broken bones in 3 different continents, used those same calloused fingers to thread a needle with surgical precision. The room was silent, save for the rhythmic shik-shik of the needle passing through the gray fabric. Jinho worked with a grim, focused intensity, reinforcing the neck, straightening the misshapen arm, and securing the button eyes until they sat firm and bright. He didn't try to make the doll look new. He simply made it strong again. When he finished, he handed it back. Perla took it, running her thumb over the new, dark stitches. They were precise, elegant, and permanent. She looked up at Jinho, then her gaze drifted to Xu Yong, who remained standing guard at the edge of the room. The realization hit her with more force than a blow. In this house, the law wasn't just about power or the fear of the serpent. It was about the preservation of what was owned. She looked at the doll, then at her own reflection in the glass. For the first time since she had walked through the golden doors, she didn't look at the trash bin. She realized that in Xu Yong's world, broken wasn't a death sentence. It was just an opportunity for the master to prove that nothing he cared for would ever be allowed to fall apart. She tucked the doll under her arm, the stitches cold and strong against her skin, and for the first time, she didn't just sit in the shadows. She leaned against the wall right next to the man with the tattoo. The dining table was a vast, obsidian slab that felt like a continent between them. Xu Yong sat at the head, his jacket discarded. The white sleeves of his shirt rolled back to reveal the serpent's tail coiled around his wrist. Across from him, Perla looked smaller than usual, her chin barely clearing the edge of the polished stone. Dinner was a quiet affair of steaming rice, braised short ribs, and an assortment of small, colorful bowls. Perla ate with a mechanical efficiency, her eyes never leaving her plate, her movements calculated to make as little sound as possible. But it wasn't her eating that caught Shu Yong's attention. It was the way her left hand moved when she thought he wasn't looking. With the practiced stealth of a thief, her fingers crept toward the bread basket. She didn't take a bite. Instead, she palmed a small, crusty roll and slid it beneath the table, her hand disappearing into the deep pocket of her oversized sweatshirt. It was a fluid, invisible motion, the movement of a child who had spent her life negotiating with hunger, knowing that a full belly today was no guarantee for tomorrow. Shu Yong set his chopsticks down. The sound, though slight, made Perla freeze. She didn't look up, but her shoulders tightened, her small frame bracing for a reprimand that, in her experience, always followed the act of taking more than was offered. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stood, walked toward the kitchen, and returned with a small, clear container fitted with a vacuum seal lid. He set it on the obsidian table beside her bowl. Perla looked at the box, then at him, her dark eyes wide with a mix of confusion and rising panic. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her hand instinctively clenching the bread inside her pocket. "Don't be," Shu Yong said, his voice a low, steady anchor in the silent room. He reached into the basket, took 2 more rolls, and placed them inside the container. He snapped the locks shut with a rhythmic click-click that echoed the sound of Jinho's repair kit. "Chef Cho makes too much. In this house, we don't throw things away, but we don't hide them either." He pushed the container toward her. "This is yours. It stays on the counter or by your bed, or wherever you need it to be. Whenever it's empty, someone will fill it. Not tomorrow, not next week. Always." Perla stared at the box. It was a simple object, but to her it was a miracle of physics, a vessel that promised to hold the future. She looked at the roll hidden in her pocket, then slowly, with trembling fingers, she pulled it out and placed it on the table. She didn't put it in the box. Instead, she took a bite, her eyes welling with a sudden, hot moisture she couldn't explain. "Always?" she asked, her voice cracking for the first time. "Always," Shu Yong repeated. He sat back down and picked up his chopsticks, returning to his meal as if he hadn't just dismantled a decade of trauma with a piece of plastic. The silence that followed was different. It was no longer the heavy quiet of 2 strangers sharing a space. It was the soft, breathing silence of a sanctuary. Perla reached out and touched the lid of the container, her fingers tracing the seal. The bread in her hand tasted like the present tense. For the first time since the rain, the armor around her heart didn't just feel heavy. It felt unnecessary. The first crack had formed, and through it, the warmth of the penthouse finally began to seep in. The peace of the penthouse was shattered not by a sound, but by a delivery. A manila envelope, damp from the persistent Chicago drizzle, was placed on Shu Yong's desk by a visibly shaken courier. Inside was no letter, only a single blurred photograph of Perla at the park, and a note written in a cold, bureaucratic hand. "Property of the state. Return the asset or we burn the house down." Marcus Vance was no longer playing at shadows. He was a man who understood that, in the city of Chicago, legal paperwork could be as lethal as a bullet if wielded by the right hands. Shu Yong didn't rage. He didn't flip his desk. He sat in the high-backed leather chair, his eyes fixed on the photograph of the girl who was currently in the kitchen, arguing with Chef Cho about the proper way to sprinkle sugar on a donut. He felt the serpent tattoo on his neck thrum with a phantom heat, the ink a permanent reminder of a debt that was now being threatened by a man who saw children as line items. He summoned his inner circle to the war room, a soundproof chamber beneath the library where the air always smelled of ozone and old secrets. Jinho stood at his right, his stitched hands clasped behind his back. 6 other men, the highest earners and the coldest killers in the syndicate, lined the table. They looked at the photograph of the little girl in the pink dress with confusion. To them, she was a distraction, a soft spot in the armor of a man they relied on to be iron. "Vance is moving," Shu Yong began, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. "He thinks he can use the law to reclaim what he calls an asset. He thinks because she is small, and because she is not of our blood, that we will fold to avoid the light." A younger captain shifted in his seat. "Sir, with respect, she's a foster kid. Is a war with the city's contractors worth the territory we might lose?" Shu Yong stood, the movement so sudden that the room went breathless. He walked to the head of the table and threw a second file down, the original Carolina file. It was yellowed, stained with a 5-year-old copper-colored smear that no one needed to be told was blood. 5 years ago, a woman named Carolina stood in a rain-slicked alley 3 blocks from here, Shu Yong said, his gaze pinning every man in the room. She wasn't syndicate. She wasn't a soldier. She was an informant who found out our location was compromised. She could have run. Instead, she took a bullet meant for the heart of this organization. She bought us the time to regroup, to survive, and to become what we are today. He leaned over the table, his face inches from the captain's. She died so you could sit in these chairs, and she left behind one request, that if the world ever came for her daughter, the man with the serpent would be the one to stand in the way. He straightened his tie, the fabric crisp and cold. We aren't protecting a girl. We are protecting the honor of the woman who saved the syndicate. If we let Vance take her, we aren't a family. We're just a gang of cowards waiting for our turn to be sold. We move tonight. I want Vance's infrastructure dismantled before the sun rises. The men didn't argue. They didn't even blink. They stood as one, the chairs scraping against the floor in a unified growl of intent. The confusion was gone, replaced by the grim, mechanical focus of men who finally understood the stakes. As they filed out, Shu Yong looked at the Carolina file one last time. The past had caught up, but it wouldn't find him hiding. It would find him armed. The storm that rolled off Lake Michigan that night was a violent echo of the evening they had met. It was not a steady rain, but a series of tectonic thuds against the floor-to-ceiling glass, the kind of thunder that felt as though the sky were cracking open to reveal the dark underneath. Inside the penthouse, the power flickered once, a sharp blink of the amber lights that left the sprawling space momentarily hollow. Shu Yong was at the window, watching the lightning illuminate the skeletal frames of the distant skyscrapers. When he heard it, it wasn't a scream. A scream would have been easier to answer. It was a low, rhythmic whimpering coming from the guest wing, a sound of someone trying to make themselves small enough to disappear. He moved through the darkened hallway, his steps silent. He pushed the door to Perla's room open just an inch. The forever container sat on the nightstand, its lid sealed tight over the rolls. She no longer felt the need to hide, but the safety it represented had been overridden by the roar of the sky. Perla was a rigid knot beneath the silk sheets, her fingers locked around the gray doll's neck so tightly the stitches Jinho had labored over were straining. Her eyes were squeezed shut, her breath coming in shallow, jagged hitches that spoke of a memory far older than the 6 years she had lived. Shu Yong sat on the edge of the bed. He didn't reach for her. He knew that to a child trapped in a nightmare, even a savior's touch can feel like a predator's grip. He was a man who spoke in the language of ultimatums and steel, a man whose voice usually commanded the silence of rooms. He looked at her small, trembling form and realized he had no weapons left for this kind of war. Then, from a place in his chest that had been boarded up since his childhood in Incheon, a melody surfaced. It was a song his mother had hummed when the world outside their paper-thin walls was loud with things he wasn't supposed to understand. He hadn't thought of the words in 20 years. He didn't even know if he remembered them correctly. But as the thunder shook the glass, he began to sing. The Korean words were low and gravelly, a stark contrast to the elegant silk of the room. Jar jar ja jang, jar solal darim sad. It was a simple lullaby, a repetitive, grounding rhythm that sought to anchor the listener to the earth. His voice wasn't practiced, and it carried the rough edge of a man who had forgotten how to be soft, but it held a steady, unwavering frequency. Perla's breathing didn't change at first. Then, as the second verse filled the room, the hitch in her chest began to smooth out. The rigidity in her shoulders dissolved, the sheets falling away as her grip on the doll loosened. She opened her eyes, not with the panic of the hunt, but with the heavy-lidded daze of someone being pulled back to the surface. She looked at Shu Yong, at the sharp jawline and the serpent tattoo that seemed to move in the dim light, and she didn't see the boss of the syndicate. She saw a man who was willing to be unmade for her peace. She reached out, her small, warm palm finding the sleeve of his shirt, and let out a long, shuddering exhale. Shu Yong didn't stop until the storm had retreated into a distant mumble. He sat there in the dark long after she had fallen back into a deep, trusting sleep, realizing that the dragon didn't just have teeth. It had a song. And for the first time, the penthouse didn't feel like a fortress. It felt like a home. The midnight air was thick with the scent of ozone and the heavy silence of an impending strike. In the war room, the monitors pulsed with infrared heat signatures moving through the alleyways below Obsidian. Marcus Vance had finally discarded the veneer of legal paperwork for the honesty of steel. He wasn't sending social workers. He was sending contractors, men who traded in the retrieval of lost assets with the cold efficiency of shadow soldiers. Perla was tucked away in the Dragon's Vault, a reinforced chamber behind the library's false wall. She sat on a plush velvet chair, the gray doll clutched to her chest, her eyes fixed on the heavy steel door. Beside her, Jinho checked the slide of his weapon with a rhythmic clack hiss. He didn't look at her with pity, but with the grim focus of a guardian whose life was forfeit if a single hair on her head was touched. The breach came not as a roar, but as a series of muffled thuds. Vance's men attempted to enter through the roof and the service elevators simultaneously, using localized jammers to blind the penthouse's external eyes. They expected a soft target, a man distracted by a child. They found instead a fortress that had been waiting for them to breathe. Xu Yong stood in the main gallery, his sleeves rolled up, the serpent on his neck seemingly alive in the flickering emergency light. He didn't hide. He moved through the space with a predatory grace, his voice a low, steady calm on the comms. The penthouse was a maze of his own design, pressure plates, reinforced glass, and kill zones that the invaders realized too late were built for exactly this kind of containment. The sound of the struggle filtered through the vault's vents, the staccato rhythm of suppressed fire, the heavy thud of bodies meeting marble, and the sharp, final snap of locks engaging. Perla listened, her small heart hammering against her ribs. In her old life, a sound like that meant someone was coming to take her, to move her, to hide her away in a place where she didn't exist. She waited for the door to be kicked in. She waited for the hand that would drag her back into the cold. But the door didn't move. The screaming stopped. The silence that followed was heavy, absolute, and earned. When the vault finally hummed open, it wasn't a stranger on the other side. It was Xu Yong. His white shirt was smudged with soot, a thin line of red tracing a shallow cut on his cheekbone, but his eyes were as steady as the morning star. He didn't say anything at first. He simply held out his hand, palm up, in the same gesture he had used the night they met. Perla looked past him. She saw the guards standing in the hallway, their faces grim but their postures respectful. She saw the sheer effort of the defense, the broken panels, and the calculated wreckage of the gallery. For the first time, the golden cage didn't feel like a prison, felt like a shield. She walked out of the vault, her bare feet hitting the warm floor, and took his hand. She looked up at the serpent tattoo, then at the man who carried it. She realized that Vance had sent an army to take her, and Xu Yong had broken that army without a second thought. She wasn't an asset to be recovered or a debt to be paid in secret. She was the one thing the dragon was willing to bleed for. As Xu Yong led her back toward the kitchen for a glass of water, Perla squeezed his hand. The weight of the world felt lighter, because for the first time in 6 years, she knew that someone had finally decided she was worth the war. The confrontation did not take place in a rain-slicked alley or a darkened warehouse. Instead, it happened in a boardroom on the 64th floor of a building made entirely of glass and cold, white light. The air was sterile, smelling of ozone and expensive cologne, a place where violence was usually committed with pens rather than pistols. Marcus Vance sat at the far end of the mahogany table, looking every bit the high-level bureaucrat he claimed to be. He was dressed in a suit that tried too hard to look like Xu Yong's, but on him, it felt like a costume. He had a stack of legal documents in front of him, injunctions, state-ordered removals, and custody claims, each one a chain designed to drag Perla back into his profitable cycle of neglect. "You're making a mistake, Xu Yong," Vance said, his voice smooth and practiced, the sound of a man who believed he was still the most dangerous person in the room because he held the paperwork. "The state doesn't care about your tattoos or your history. They care about their assets. And Perla is a high-value asset." Xu Yong didn't sit. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the city he owned, his hands clasped behind his back. He didn't look at Vance. He looked at the reflection of the serpent on his neck in the glass. Beside him, Jinho stood with a leather briefcase that felt heavier than a weapon. "I don't care about the state," Shu Yong said, his voice a low, terrifying vibration that seemed to make the water in Vance's glass tremble. "And I certainly don't care about your definitions." He signaled to Jinho, who opened the briefcase and slid a single, thick document across the mahogany. It wasn't an argument. It was an execution. "That is the full audit of your independent contracting firm," Shu Yong continued, turning slowly to face Vance. "It tracks every dollar moved through the offshore accounts you used to hide the placement fees you charged rival syndicates. It also includes the sworn testimony of 3 caseworkers you thought you'd silenced." Vance's face went the color of ash. He reached for the papers, but his hands were shaking too much to turn the pages. "I didn't come here to kill you, Marcus," Shu Yong said, stepping toward the table, his presence suddenly overwhelming the room. "Blood is messy, and Perla doesn't like the smell of it. I came here to buy you." He dropped a second folder onto the table. It contained a series of shell company acquisitions. "As of 9 o'clock this morning, I own the debt on your house, your firm's primary lease, and the pension fund you've been skimming from. You have 2 choices. You sign the full, irrevocable surrender of guardianship for Perla and disappear from this city, or I release these files to the federal prosecutor waiting in the lobby." Vance looked at the pen on the table. It was a heavy, gold thing, glinting under the sterile lights. He looked at Shu Yong's eyes and realized that the paper war was already over. There was no negotiation with a dragon that had decided to swallow the entire mountain. With a trembling hand, Vance signed. Shu Yong picked up the document, checking the ink with the same meticulous care Jinho had used to check his stitches. No blood had been spilled in the room, but as Shu Yong walked out, he knew he had ended a reign of terror more effectively than a bullet ever could. He wasn't just holding a signature. He was holding Perla's future, typed and signed in the present tense. For the first time in his life, Shu Yong felt the true weight of his wealth, and it felt like peace. The following month, the biting Chicago winter finally broke, surrendering to a spring that smelled of damp earth and the distant, cooling promise of the lake. The city was bathed in the long, honeyed light of a sunset that turned the skyline into a silhouette of brushed gold. At the edge of Lincoln Park, where the concrete met the vast, quiet expanse of Lake Michigan, the wind was no longer a blade, but a soft exhale. Perla stood at the water's edge, her feet finally steady on the ground. She was wearing a new pink gown, one that was clean and dry, its fabric catchlights shimmering like the surface of the water. Her hair was neatly braided, and the gray doll, now sporting a tiny silk scarf Chef Cho had fashioned from a scrap of Shu Yong's tie, was tucked loosely under her arm. She no longer gripped it with the white-knuckled desperation of the hunted. She held it with the casual ease of a child who knew the doll would be there when she woke up. Shu Yong sat on a stone bench a few feet behind her. He had traded his charcoal suit for a lighter jacket, his sleeves rolled up to the mid-forearm. He watched her watch the horizon, the way the orange light caught the roundness of her cheeks and the peace in her eyes. He felt a strange, quiet stillness in his own chest, a sensation so foreign he almost didn't recognize it as contentment. Perla turned back to him, her shadow stretching long and thin across the grass. She walked over and leaned against his knee, looking up at him with that ancient, measuring gaze she had carried since the first night in the rain. "Mr. she whispered. "Shu Yong," he corrected gently, the name feeling lighter in the air than it ever had before. "Shu Yong," she repeated, testing the weight of it. She reached out, her finger tracing the edge of his jaw, stopping just before the dark ink on his neck. "Why did you do it? Why did you take me in when nobody else wanted me?" Shu Yong looked at her, then drifted his gaze to the lake. In the reflection of the water, he saw the faint, dark coil of the serpent dragon on his skin. For years, he had believed that tattoo marked him as a man apart, a predator who owed nothing to the world but silence and force. He thought he had been the one doing the saving, the one providing the sanctuary, the one paying a debt to a ghost. But as he looked back at the small girl who had walked into his fortress and demanded he become a human again, he realized the truth. He reached down and tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, his hand steady and warm. I didn't take you in because you were lost, Perla, he said, his voice a low, melodic truth that resonated in the quiet of the evening. I took you in because I was the one who was lost, and you were the only one who found the way home. Perla didn't need to ask anything else. She simply nodded, a small, knowing movement, and climbed up onto the bench beside him. She opened her forever container, which was full of the almond cookies they both liked, and offered him one in the present tense. Shu Yong took it, and as the sun finally dipped below the horizon, the man and the girl sat in the deepening purple light, two souls who had stopped running because they had finally run out of reasons to be afraid. Under the shadow of the dragon, the war was over, and the family had begun. The dragon is not defined by the fire it breathes, but by the horde it protects. Shu Yong learned that power is a hollow throne until it serves a purpose higher than survival. Perla taught him that a debt to the past is best paid by investing in the future, and that the strongest fortresses are built not of steel, but of trust. In a world that treats the vulnerable as a commodity, the ultimate act of rebellion is to choose to belong. We are never truly lost as long as we have someone worth finding our way home for. Have you ever been lost? Let us know in the comments below. Let us know where you are watching from and what you would have added or taken out from this story. Thanks for watching. Sit back, relax, and let me tell you another story.